Hey, so I picked a American Library Association text to focus on for my book choice, and this book was Resilience by Rebecca Smith Aldrich. It was written in 2018, and I picked it because it was a way of connecting a lot of the themes in our textbooks to my own profession. And so what I did was I sort of put together some quotes and some points from the book, and I'll connect it to some of the concepts and threads that we were discussing in class. So first, what is resilience? Resilience, by definition, is the capacity that enables people, places, and systems to survive, adapt, and thrive. And in the first section of this book, which was defining resilience, the thing that I found the most interesting was that resilience was not necessarily just for an individual. I think a lot of the research that I've been involved with or read about has been thinking about resilience in terms of personal development or child development, people being resilient in the face of adversity. And so this book presented it as resilient systems and resilient organizations. And I'll get more into that in a little bit when it comes to what the causes of resilience are. But basically, the whole theme throughout the entire book was that people, groups, and institutions can nurture resilience and become more resilient by embracing diversity on all fronts. So basically, the more variety, diversity, the more open you are to different experiences, different viewpoints, the more resilient you're going to be. And so, what was interesting was that on an individual level or systemic level, diversity and inclusion and equity and just opposing and complementary viewpoints make people and systems more diverse and more resilient, which I found was a really interesting point. Um, Again, the first section of the book talked about the climate of today and what's going on today and why we need resilience and why resilience is an issue. And I liked this quote: situational awareness today reveals an amplified disruption on just about every front: political, economic, technological, environmental, and social. So we're basically hyper aware of everything, and we're constantly bombarded with media and information. And as an information professional and, information scientists, librarians are very aware of people's cognitive load and just how damaging too much information can be to the process of the brain and resilience. And so this causes a sort of constant case of disruption. And a good example of the balance between good and bad disruption can be just sort of anything that is disruptive in terms of systems. A good example of the balance between good and bad disruption is nowhere more evident than in the advent of the internet. And so this is something that has been written about in our profession for over 40 years, because we were using the internet before it was cool. And it's really been disruptive in a positive and negative way in terms of information access. And so the combination of information overload and the disruptive nature of the internet and access to information has made us susceptible to a lot of the stressors that would impact or prevent resilience. By expanding our situational awareness across the globe, the modern media and information landscape has generated an environment of constant and amplified disruption. So basically, we're just always living on information overload, which again speaks to the need for resilience on an individual and systemic level. And it also goes to the cause. So the book proposed 4 different main points for embracing and building resilience within organizations. The first is about just being local. Adaptations that will strengthen communities are place and context specific, with no single approach for reducing risks appropriate across all settings. So basically, when you're serving a population, to make that population feel resilient, and to have that population generate a resilient response in times of crisis, focusing on the needs of that specific place that are specific to that environment. And I think about that in terms of Vermont. An example would be just understanding the low internet bandwidth for a lot of people and building services that account for that bandwidth being minimal. And so that's an example of understanding the local environment and building responsible and inclusive services that will then reflect a sort of culture of resilience. And this one seems obvious, but this is work together. Adaptation, planning, and implementation can be enhanced through complementary actions across levels from individuals to governments. So basically, like working outside of your own field, reaching out and working with people who are not necessarily within the library profession, for this example. So working with local governments, working with high schools, working with archivist groups and historical societies. So working together, not only does that build community, which is something that we learned about in the texts, and especially when it comes to democratic decision making, working with people and bringing in people to be as inclusive as possible, making decisions as groups and working with groups, make sure that all of the stakeholders feel valued and feel listened to, and then in a sense that kind of makes the network of involved stakeholders more resilient as a group. And of course, value diversity. Recognition of diverse interests, circumstances, social, cultural context, and expectation can benefit the decision-making processes. So this kind of goes without saying because of the context of our course, but bringing in diverse viewpoints, not necessarily just socioeconomic or racial or cultural, but from an age perspective, from a gender perspective, from I think a location perspective, and also from in the library world, from a literacy perspective, brings in lots of different voices and helps make decision making more democratic. And this is a big one for the library profession, is to help all be heard. This text focused a lot more on public library work than academic library work, but one of the charges of libraries is to help people increase their capacity and voice for influence, especially for low-income groups and vulnerable communities, and their partnerships with local government, and also benefit adaptation. So basically, the way that you can be a mouthpiece for the underserved and help them access the resources that are available that they may not have known are available. Obviously, that builds resilience in those individuals, but it also helps build resilience in the community. And so only by putting our community at the heart of what we do and how we do it can we transcend as libraries. And so again, this is sort of about more community libraries and public libraries, but I found this was interesting because it really goes back to the issue of being local and making sure that you're reflecting the values and appreciating the values and the culture of the local community that you're serving. Leaders should strive to create a culture of resistance by modeling capability and calm in the face of chaos and discord. So this talks a little bit there were a couple of case studies in the book that talk about both systemic and organizational, but also personal resilience. And that the information I took away regarding leadership was about how leaders can't necessarily always teach resilience, but you can model resilience by your response to the situation. And just going back to the old adage that you can't control the situation, but you can control your response to it, which is just good advice in general for all of us. And the attitude that we're all in this together is the only way forward. I also liked this quote because it goes to, it talks, going back to the Clark and Teach Out book, it really makes me think about the democratic process and trying to move forward collectively, again, bringing in lots of different voices, making people feel heard. And then in the other text, thinking back about the conversational discourse and the discourse analysis, and making sure that people who might not always be heard can be heard. So, taking turns and reaching out to people to ask for their input, or making a point to make input accessible across lots of different ways. So making forms that ask for input ADA compliant, and making forms and input in different languages, making meetings available at multiple times to meet working parents' needs. So there were a lot of elements that were presented in the case studies. I loved this quote, of course. Librarians are long haul thinkers. We tend to be interested in this sort of idea of resilience because we do see the big picture, where we are long-term thinkers. And I liked this quote because it reminded me of having to step back and see the big picture, which is also a characteristic of resilience. When you're feeling chaos and when you're feeling in a crisis mode, stepping back is always something that can help. And what the world needs now, right now, is what libraries are already good at providing. We're not necessarily good at telling people what we provide, but we are good at providing them. We're good at preserving the past and striving for historical equity. And what that means is there's a balance between preserving the past as it existed and the past as it was written about. And that's a constant evolution. Just the way that scholarship evolves, libraries have to evolve to reflect known information and attitudes of the day. So we're always trying to make collections equitable and reflect the changes in how people view the world in different worldviews, while also trying to preserve the past so that it can be studied and analyzed and that we can learn from it. And of course, we prepare people for the future and help people find their voices, help students become more information literate and learn digital literacy, and help people access information to improve their lives. So we're all already good at doing all these things. And so libraries really contribute to individual and cultural resilience. And some really specific examples I went through. These were not in the book, but these were examples that I came up with as I was reading through the case studies. And preserving the past while representing the present. So a really specific example is weeding titles that reinforce stereotypes or institutional racism. Getting rid of things that don't reflect modern attitudes. Again, while trying to balance the preservation of documents that are have historical value. We empower people to express their choices. An example of that is just setting up voter registration in the library, making voting more accessible, promoting the idea of voting on, for everybody. One of the resilience elements is providing people with access to information when and where they need it. That is moving collections online, connecting users with mobile technology, and of course, making it more accessible in different languages and for reading capabilities. And then breaking down information barriers, helping to, and offering information in multiple languages and formats to meet diverse needs. So those are some specific examples of what libraries are doing to increase the capability of people, which then again feeds into overall resilience. So that was the book. It was broken down into some different sections about basic what resilience is and how it's affecting libraries, and then case studies. I found it really interesting, and I found that it helped expand my view of what I think of when I think of resilience, and just that. Like I said, the idea that the more diverse you can be in your approach and worldview, the more resilient you can be. And that's the presentation.